Hello, ladies and gentlemen, veterans, dedicated VA employees, everybody watching. Welcome back. Let's do another video where we talk about VA disability. For those who don't know, I'm Attorney Matthew Lang, VA accredited attorney. And in this video, I'm going to talk about, let's call it VA decision errors from an attorney perspective. I'm going to talk about some of those errors that I see from my perspective from the side of the house. But I'm going to add a unique twist to it. And the unique twist is the experience and the training and education I have, both as an attorney and as a former VA employee within the benefits arena with disability claims. So let's get down to it. Imagine, if you will, veterans, you get that notification letter either through the website, the app, the mail, all three perhaps. You're really kind of confused by what it says because there's a whole lot there. Well, we're just going to kind of ignore that stuff for a second and jump to the part that's inside that package that's known as the rating decision. It's got the VA seal up on top, and it breaks itself down into an introduction, decisions of the issues, an evidence listing, and a narrative of each condition or issue being decided. This is known as the narrative portion of the rating decision. Now, there's also another piece that doesn't come in that package, known as a code sheet, and that's okay. That comes up play with some different other things. But the main focus we're going to put on is the errors that are seen in the decision piece of this narrative portion. What I find fascinating throughout life, and even working now on the other side of the table, as I call it, with the VA disability claims, is that we always have unique perspectives to everything. Everybody's been exposed to different things, different levels of education, different training, different life experiences. So when I was working within the VA, I didn't necessarily see a lot of the stuff as errors. Why? Because that's what I was trained as to do, was to exactly what VA still does today for years. Now it's been the same. Now, it hasn't been quite the exact same the entire time I was working with the VA. There's definitely been some changes in how the process is done, and even when the changes occur, I will admit that I thought they were worse off and not quite so adequate. But you get to a point where when you're trained and you work a certain way and you just start doing what you're told, and that becomes right. And that's not an error then. But when I came to the other side of the table and decided to represent veterans with their claim, with all the legal knowledge I have, the legal training I've got, the VA training and knowledge I have, I realized those are actually errors. The perspective changed. So that's why I want to do this video, is because I'm really hoping that even veterans yourself, when you see these decisions, you come to kind of understand why they may be worded this way and what maybe some of those errors may look like. And for VA, I want you to see the other side of the table from that unique perspective that I carry as a former VA benefits employee and now as an attorney working to represent veterans. So let's get down to it. I don't have an exact list, and I haven't written anything really down. Let me scribble on my piece of paper here to keep my thoughts straight. So I'm just going to give you really an overview in this video off the top of my head. There's a lot of things I see consistently over and over, and a lot of frustration I know veterans have. I've heard the frustrations. I've sat and listened to them, and I know frustrations even I have as a veteran myself and somebody watching my brothers and sisters in arms struggle with a process that should not be this difficult. So let's start with one of the basic things I see. The evidence list for the VA is a listing of evidence that I'm going to sum up as should be evidence that is considered in making the decision, but it's supposed to be relevant evidence. But the error that I really see from this side is that many times evidence in that listing has nothing to do with the issue on hand. But I can usually tell from my experience that that listing is likely nothing more than just every piece of evidence in the veteran's claim file, VA claim file there. And why was that done? Well, from my experience and my understanding, and was that it was done as a CYA, a way to cover yourself. The idea was the concern that when you go through the evidence and you happen to miss something in that list, it may be seen as an error for missing something, and it is ultimately. I mean, if the VA's job is to review, weigh, analyze all persuasive, unpersuasive, all relevant evidence, and something's missing, well, yeah, it's an error. I mean, because you've failed as a decision maker to, well, just do exactly that: weigh and consider and evaluate and analyze. So I understand that, but the problem here is by giving just a list of everything in the file, it's also an error, because you're really communicating to especially myself from my point of view now, that you as a decision maker have decided to rush the issues, not pay any attention to the evidence, and likely didn't open anything up. So again, you haven't considered, you haven't analyzed, you haven't really followed the federal law or the court's interpretations of the law in making that decision. So it gets a little tough sometimes to see when stuff is missing from the decision, or when it looks like there's just a sloppy list of everything in the file. Because the other error that usually follows with it is when we come down to the narrative piece of the decision. So, and we've got, let's just use an example of condition of sleep apnea. It's a popular claim I work with back here. Sleep apnea. And then we have, that's the only issue. And then we have our evidence listing, but evidence listing includes stuff from like a hearing loss and a back and a knee condition all in it. Well, those clearly aren't relevant. Well, we're going to say in this scenario they're not relevant. We're gonna say it's direct service connection theory in my hypothetical, because there's definitely some other possibilities that they might be relevant in certain cases. So remember, don't go saying everything I got here in my hypothetical is gospel. Everybody's facts of the case is different, so don't take this as like advice, please. It's meant for education purposes. So my hypothetical may not fit your facts of the case, veterans. You may actually have more, and maybe what I say here is not completely applicable to your case. But take the idea that, say we have a sleep apnea claim and we've got a bunch of other evidence listed for different conditions in the evidence list. Well, the issue comes is if you're going to list those pieces of evidence there, what you've really communicated, VA, is that this is evidence you've considered to be relevant to the claim. And that's the way I take it as an attorney back here. So you wouldn't be listing them if they weren't worth reviewing or relevant, really is the best way of saying that, to the claim. But then we get down the narrative and we find that none of that evidence is even discussed. It's not analyzed. It's not talked about. There's nothing there for it. So even in the VA's guidance and manuals and stuff, you usually find that, okay, you need to have this evidence list. But when you look at those guidance, you look at that federal law, you look at those court interpretations, what it also tells you is that doesn't meet the requirements by itself as consideration. That narrative actually now is required to talk about those. And what happens is they're not talked about, which really gives the impression that they're technically not considered. They're not analyzed. I don't know if they were persuasive or unpersuasive for the decision. So it lacks a lot of clarity. And I think that's what we're going to really get into here, is because the ultimate purpose of the decision and the narrative, especially underneath the laws and the interpretation of the courts, is that this has to be written in a way for the veterans, for you veterans, when you read this, that you can have an understanding, and not just an understanding, but it should be a fairly clear understanding of the reasons to why a decision was denied. And even granted, essentially. But focusing on the denied part, you need to have the understanding of why it's denied. Well, and this understanding has to be as clear as possible because you have appeal rights. And if it's not clearly provided in the narrative, or clear as possible, we call it clear as possible. But if it doesn't fit essentially the law and the court cases interpretation on how it's supposed to be, and veterans, you can't understand it because of that, well, we don't have a proper legal decision. You don't know what to appeal, and it really hinders you now in the process. So that's why we really need the clarity to begin with. But that becomes really another error in the process, is not providing the clarity necessary for an appeal. Really, VA, unfortunately, and that's what it causes. And I understand you may not see it that way, and maybe some do. I mean, I'm not saying that really makes this error, but I realize from now looking back at my experience that I didn't see it from that perspective. I didn't see how I was hindering the process. I was just doing what I was told, which happens to be hindering the process. Did the individuals know that was hindering the process that told me? I don't know, and I can't tell you what their intent was, and nor can I be in their minds or in their heads to understand that. Maybe they didn't know. So let's look further in the process here. We get down into the narratives after the evidence list a little bit more. Now, we've already talked about how things in the evidence list aren't talked about that are relevant and so forth. And no clear indication of what meaning they had in the decision. But the other big problem we have is there's a lot of system text that's canned text in the VA now. When the electronic version of, or the paperless version, I should say, it's always kind of electronic in a way. When the paperless version, known as VDMS, came out, it really started revolutionizing auto text. We're going to say just this canned text process and clicking buttons and having text fill in. So what we know as AI today was kind of always there in the background. The computer was kind of doing that for us. We say, this is what we need, and it goes, oh, here's that text. And it inserts and writes the decision essentially for you. But that's a problem. It's there for assistance. It's not there to write the decision completely for the decision maker, but we find a lot of decisions on this side that are written solely by the computer. And I recognize the text because I lived it. I helped give birth to the program. And I know what it is. I can tell you the shorthand cut keys that existed and may still exist today. I don't know, but existed to get that text to pop up there. And so it gets frustrating because the law, again, says that not only does the narrative have to be clear enough so veterans can appeal, and it has to, again, analyze and all the evidence, but it has to be more than conclusionary statements. So a decision that's only got conclusionary statements in it is not a proper decision. It's just not a proper legal decision. That's an error. And that's what happens when you rely only on the system to generate the text. And now, granted, not everybody relies on the system to generate text. I have had a couple people, well, I'll say more than a couple, but recently I've seen a couple rely on it really heavily. And it's just frustrating because all I have is canned text that just says something like, your service treatment records, your STRs, showed no complaints, treatment or diagnosis of your condition in service. Your condition is denied because we didn't find any link to your service. Things like that. And it's really frustrating because, well, that's great. So when we put the law together as a whole, the idea that the STRs don't show any complaints treatment or diagnosis is definitely a relevant piece to the puzzle, but leaving just that conclusionary text and not explaining why that weighs so heavily in denying the claim and why that's your reason for denying, because it can't be your sole reason, shouldn't be the sole reason. And again, in accordance with the federal law and the court's interpretations and other VA guidance. So it's really an error by just putting these conclusionary sentences in here that do that, because you're now VA, unfortunately, what it looks like you're saying is even though we're supposed to, underneath the law, consider events in service and all these other things going on, and we only consider the event a documented STR. Well, that's not fair. Anybody who's been in the service should know that not everything is documented in the STRs. And then one of the fun ones, really, when it comes to the documentation of the STRs in that conclusionary statement, is especially mental health claims. I'll see that all the time. VA guidance will tell you, law will tell you, and not just VA law, but privacy law and HIPAA laws in general will tell you that mental health records are treated much differently than just your typical everyday medical records. So STRs are not supposed to contain mental health records. So if you're denying a claim solely with that canned statement, or mental health claim in this case, that it was not no complaints, diagnosis, or no complaints, treatment, or diagnosis is in service in your STRs, well, duh. I don't know how else to put that. Well, duh. They're not good. They're not supposed to be there, so of course they're not there. But that's an error I see. VA will rely on this canned text, and there's no real conceptual thought behind the evidence. There's no consideration of anything. It's just a hurry, slap it in there, fill, and throw out the door. And we'll talk about some more of that later on in other videos too. But that's what it is. And then the idea, like the other example I used, not incurred in service. Well, why is that? What did you consider that showed that it wasn't in service? Was there something that showed that it could have been? Was there a possibility it was? I mean, I don't know, because there's no narrative written there for that canned text. It's just a conclusion. And an unsupported conclusion is just not enough to make the decision valid. So that's one thing we have problems with there. Now, don't get me wrong, I see other people try. Other decision makers try, and some do a good job with it. I'm not gonna say everybody's really bad decision making. There's definitely a lot of great people I met along the way, and a lot of great decision makers that were out there. We all still make our mistakes, but the idea here is that some will still try to put in that extra verbiage, knowing that they're supposed to. But then what happens is they put in stuff that becomes even more of an error, because now they're starting to show bias, personal opinion, and they're not giving actual legal reasoning. They're giving what appears to be more personal bias. And maybe they don't realize it either, because now from my perspective, I realize that some of that training that the VA gives, and again, I don't know for this case, but just in my opinion, it's kind of biased. So the idea is here that if it says, a lot of times what I'll see is something along the lines of a private DBQ, a disability benefits questionnaire. So veterans, you go to off to your provider, you obtain a completely adequate, legitimate DBQ. You submit it as part of your claim. You may do this for different reasons. Maybe you get your treatment outside of the VA. Maybe you have trust issues with the VA medical facilities, and it's totally understandable. As I see OIG reports come through, congressional hearings, just the experiences I had myself within the system as a VA employee with different medical centers, they're all not the same. Some are just not so great. And it's just part of being a big system, unfortunately. I think it stands true in the private sector as well. Not every doctor is perfect. Not every nurse is perfect. Not every PA is perfect. So you get that right to see who you want, and so that's what you do. You go see who you want. You get the documentation you need that's adequate. You turn it in. For some reason, I'll see a lot of times the errors of not using that evidence, but there won't be a legal reasoning to why not to use it. It'll be something along the lines of just saying, well, it was insufficient. Okay, well, that goes back to the inclusionary piece. Well, that's great. If you found it insufficient, you have to tell me why. So some people will. In my example in this next error here is that they'll tell me that it was insufficient because medical records that were in your file or are in your file from 5, 6, 7 years ago shows your condition's not that bad. Yeah. Let that sink in for a second. So, knowing that conditions get worse, knowing that this DBQ is providing that over the years adequate information that says this is worsened symptoms despite any treatment or non-treatment, VA will say, well, we're trying to debunk that by saying that it doesn't match perfectly with records from 7, 6, 5 years ago. I'm going to need a little bit more, VA. A little bit more. It's just not a good legal reason. We know conditions, symptoms vary every day. We feel pain differently, even just as human beings. Some days it hurts more than others. Some days we have flare-ups. Some days things just work great and we feel young again for maybe a couple hours. I don't know, but that's the point. It always changes. So to try to debunk a piece of evidence from something that is so far from that field is not a good way of showing that you're meeting the laws by giving a narrative. And then you tell me that you weigh this evidence over this private evidence, which again, it's an error because you haven't given a good legal rationale as to why. And then many times it's more of an error on my side from my perspective because I've already given you a brief that explains, or some sort of write-up that explains how that information does not legally hold any water over the DBQ before you made that decision, and then you still do it anyways. We get there though. We keep appealing. So there's that too, and I think that's just some really popular errors I see just in the decision maker write up. But I'm going to give you just one more as this video has gone a little bit longer than I expected. But another big error I see from my side is that a lot of these decisions will rely on inadequate medical opinions. So VAs really struggle with this, from my experience and my opinion, in when it comes to exams. Exams have been this really unique field. It's usually been number one or in the top, probably five, even errors within the VA. And if it's not listed there now by VA's standards, it's probably because somebody moved the line to get it out of there. I'd like to think because of what I see every day. But now keep in mind, I don't. What I see every day is not the perfect sampling of errors that the VA makes constantly. But I know VA exams are always on the top. And here's why. So from, again, this is my experience, my perspective, my opinions. They may not be agreed with, and that's fine. There's a comment section. I do encourage, feel free, or we can have a proper discussion. There's no reason to have arguments or fight over everything, but we can definitely have a good, proper discussion as to points of view, perspectives, especially because I'm not you who's watching, and I'm not the person making the decisions anymore inside the wall there. So maybe there's something changed that I'm missing. So we can always throw that down there. But the idea is that VA exams used to be a series of paragraphs when I first started. And decision makers had to really put a lot of thought into their decision. They had to decide and interpret what the examiner was really saying as it fit with the law. It made a slower process. Sometimes I think it was a little better process. because we actually had to think about what we were doing. But I get it. The process got slowed down, backlogs occur. Over time, this process changed. That's why we have the DBQs we have today. So what we're seeing is a lot of checkboxes. Well, the problem is that checkboxes doesn't necessarily mean that the exam's adequate just because the box is checked. I hear there's a whole team out there that's really just checking, making sure boxes are checked properly, and they're calling that quality. But if that's the case, that's kind of sad. If not, my apologies there. I've heard wrong and didn't mean to pass anything negative there. That was not true. But the idea here is that when we get these medical opinions back, we still have checkboxes. And what happens, and I was guilty of it as well, but the checkbox says, for example, the condition was not at least as likely as not, something along those lines, weird wording, due to whatever source. And then once that box is seen, a lot of decision makers, I see it even on these decisions here from my perspective again, we'll just see that box checked and go, oh, negative opinion, didn't meet the element, it's denied. But the problem is they're copying and pasting rationales from the exams that are very clearly not adequate underneath VA guidelines, federal law, court interpretation. And then by just copying and pasting and saying that this is why it's denied, again, doesn't fit that, in my opinion, in my experience as an attorney, doesn't fit that criteria for a proper explanation. Because it's not the doctor who's supposed to be making the decision, the legal decision. And essentially, that's what you've done there. And so it becomes, that alone becomes an error at copy and paste. But also what's the error is the decision is now relied solely on, many times, or has relied on inadequate evidence to make a decision. Because one of the main popular ones I see that get really frustrating from examiners is that they'll tell me that, or they'll tell the VA or even whoever's reading the file at this point, that the condition is not likely due to, say, service or another service-connected condition, because there's no research, no medical literature, no medical treatises out there that show that there's a link between condition and these events in service, or condition and the service-connected condition. And I find that very annoying on my side, because as I am not a medical provider, I am not a medical professional. However, my job requires me to read all kinds of medical literature, treatises, journals. And when I read this on conditions that are especially very commonly claimed and very common among the veteran population, I then have to appeal the claim and go, well, that's interesting, doc, nurse, PA, whoever, because here's 12 references in medical literatures and journals that say otherwise. So it's really an error when, again, that the decision maker has relied on an inadequate medical opinion and hasn't given any real consideration or thought into the evidence or that opinion itself. The box is checked, and it feels like we just move on, and that's really an error in itself. The decision is not legally binding. In my mind, it doesn't meet the requirements, even though we'll play the game as if it is. Other issues I'll see in there is doctors won't provide rationales that are supporting of any evidence, or they'll provide general rationales of the population and not even talk about the veteran's case, or they won't discuss things the veteran says, or they'll just say that it's not likely due to, because it's not documented in STRs. Well, the courts have said that's automatically an inadequate exam. I argue it every day back here, but it's used anyways. Anyhow, ladies and gentlemen, way too long of a video. I think today I try to keep these short, so I know you got things to do too. But I also try to be as informative as possible. But this is the perspectives from myself. as an attorney representing veterans, as somebody who's worked inside the VA, who has been trained and taught and has made uh, these errors myself, unfortunately, usually not understanding that that's what was happening there. But in general, that's really what it comes down to, is the errors within the decision typically revolve around the idea that the narrative doesn't meet the federal laws and court interpretations and VA guidelines as to what it's supposed to be. And some of those VA guidelines may or may not be quite in par, in my opinion, again, with those laws and court interpretations. So I think that is an issue as well. But there you go, VA. Now you have some things to look forward to. Hopefully, let's smooth this out. Let's see if we can help the process. I know you've got all kinds of other things going on. You've got productions, you've got quality, you've got you got other stresses too. But remember, you're working on a veteran's claim. These are people who have sacrificed part of their life to allow us to be here today. Some didn't make it, some did. So take care of the families as well, please. Remember, when you write that decision, it's got to be more than canned text. It's got to provide better information, and please don't try to get your personal opinion involved. I mean, it's sad the law even tells you that you're not supposed to put your personal opinion in it. We still do today, even like I said, perhaps even from a higher training level. But that's really what it is. Inadequate exams, not a proper rationale, conclusionary statements, not discussing evidence correctly, listing wrong evidence just to thinking you're covering yourself, not listing relevant evidence that you should have considered. These are just the errors that I see from the attorney perspective. A few, anyways. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you again for coming to another video, listening to me to give some information here. As always, I encourage the sharing, the subscribing, the liking, the comments below on any video. I still want this to be a platform where we all can learn from each other. We can smooth out a process over time. We can get things done without too much headache. As I've told people before in the VA, I want you to put me out of a job. That's my goal. I love helping veterans, but if the VA was magically to a point where errors were so little you didn't need me anymore, I would be definitely okay with that. But in the meantime, veterans, I think that's a long way away. So don't forget to visit veteranlane.com if you want to chat about your claim. Maybe you have concerns that your claim was not decided properly, evidence wasn't reviewed correctly. Some of these errors may exist in your file. You don't think you got an adequate VA exam, whatever the reason may be. Contact me through my website. You get a chance to go to my calendar there, set up a time. I'll give you a phone call. We'll chat. See if I can do anything for you. Maybe I put you in the right direction. If I can't, maybe I can. We'll sign you up and we'll fight your claim for you and help you along the way there. Anyhow, thank you everybody and have a wonderful day.